"You're basically homeless now, Margaret," my daughter-in-law Claire said across the kitchen table, as casually as if she were commenting on the weather. And in that quiet moment, I realized that losing my farm might not be the worst thing that had happened to me that week. My name is Margaret Dawson, though most people in our little Iowa town have called me Maggie for the last 40 years. I'm 68 years old, and until recently I had lived my entire adult life on a small farm just outside Cedar Ridge, about 6 miles from the nearest gas station, and surrounded by rolling fields that turn the color of honey every August. My late husband Robert and I bought that land when we were young and stubborn and believed hard work could fix almost anything. It wasn't a big place by Midwestern standards, about 120 acres, with an old red barn, a white farmhouse that creaked during winter winds, and a long gravel road that curved past a line of maple trees Robert planted the year our son Daniel was born. Every fence post on that property held a memory. Every field had a story. For decades, the farm woke with the sunrise and slept with the sound of crickets, and I thought it would outlive me, the way land usually does. But 3 nights ago, a dry autumn wind swept across the county, and before dawn, the barn was filled with smoke. By the time the volunteer fire trucks arrived from town, the flames had already taken the roof and most of the structure beneath it. The firefighters did what they could, and they were kind about it, but sometimes wood that has stood for 50 years simply gives up all at once.
When the sun came up, the barn that Robert built with his own hands was gone. The farmhouse was damaged beyond repair, and the life I had known for 4 decades had turned into a quiet field of blackened boards and twisted metal. I stood there that morning, holding the old brass key to the front door, even though the door itself no longer existed. People from town came by with coffee and blankets, and the insurance agent promised we would sort things out eventually. But by afternoon, my son Daniel had already started talking about practical solutions. Daniel lives in a newer house about 15 minutes away with Claire and their 2 teenagers. It's a comfortable place with a wide driveway and one of those stainless steel refrigerators that makes ice automatically. That evening, they invited me over for dinner while we figured out what my next step should be. I remember sitting at their kitchen table under bright ceiling lights that made everything feel strangely formal. Daniel kept scrolling through numbers on his phone, mentioning property values and rebuilding costs. Claire poured iced tea into a tall glass and slid it toward me with a polite smile that never quite reached her eyes. Then she leaned back in her chair and said the sentence I can still hear as clearly as the ticking clock on their wall. "You're basically homeless now, Margaret." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't even sound unkind. That was the part that surprised me most. To her, it was simply a fact, like saying the sky was cloudy or the road needed repairs. Daniel didn't correct her. He just nodded slowly and said we should start looking into senior housing options in town. I stared at the condensation sliding down the side of my glass and realized something colder than the autumn wind had settled over that kitchen.
For the first time in my life, I understood that the place I had raised my son was gone, and the family I thought would help me rebuild might already be planning a future that didn't include me. And that was the moment another memory surfaced, quiet but persistent, like a light turning on in a dark hallway. Many years ago, long before Daniel grew up and long before my hair turned silver, there had been a small boy who used to wait for me on a front porch every summer afternoon, a boy whose parents were always traveling and who called me Miss Maggie with a smile that could brighten an entire room. I had not thought about him in years, not really, but as Claire's words echoed in my mind and the kitchen clock ticked past 8 o'clock, I suddenly wondered if Lucas Whitmore might still remember the woman who used to read him bedtime stories while his parents built their fortune. And for the first time since the fire, I began to consider making a phone call. I did not sleep much that night in Daniel's guest room. The house was quiet, except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of a freight train rolling somewhere across the Iowa plains. I lay there staring at the ceiling fan turning slowly above me and tried to imagine my farm without the barn, without the porch, without the kitchen window where I had watched more than 40 harvests come and go. It felt impossible to picture, like trying to remember a song after someone has erased the melody. Around 3 in the morning, I finally got out of bed and walked to the window. Daniel's neighborhood looked neat and peaceful under the streetlights. Every lawn was trimmed, every driveway was clean. It was the kind of quiet comfort that comes from newer houses and steady paychecks. My farm had never looked like that. Farms are messy places, full of dirt and wind and stubborn machinery that breaks at the worst possible moment. But they are also honest places. When something grows there, it grows because you worked for it. When something fails, you know exactly why. That honesty had shaped my entire life. Robert used to say that land teaches patience better than any school ever could. I could still hear his voice sometimes when the wind moved across the fields. I walked into the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water, careful not to wake anyone. On the counter, I saw a folder Daniel had left open. Inside were printed listings for senior apartments in Cedar Ridge. Small one-bedroom units, elevator access, weekly shuttle service to the grocery store. The photos showed tidy living rooms with beige carpet and identical curtains. I stared at those pictures for a long moment and tried to imagine myself there. A quiet building where every hallway smelled faintly of cleaning solution and where the biggest daily decision might be what time to attend bingo night. There was nothing wrong with a place like that. Many good people lived in communities like those. But the thought of trading 120 acres of open land for 600 square feet of carpet made something inside my chest tighten. I closed the folder gently and sat down at the kitchen table. The digital clock on the microwave read 4:12 in bright green numbers. That was when the memory returned again, clearer this time. A large house on the other side of town, many years ago. A little boy sitting cross-legged on a living room rug while I read him stories after school. Lucas Whitmore had been 7 years old when his parents hired me to watch him during the afternoons. His father was building a business back then, and his mother traveled frequently for work. They needed someone steady to be there when Lucas came home from school. I had been younger then, still balancing farm chores and raising Daniel, but those afternoons had become part of my routine. Lucas had always asked endless questions about everything, about tractors, about how corn grew so tall, about why the moon sometimes appeared during the day. He had been a thoughtful child, the kind who listened carefully when you answered him. Over the years, his parents moved away, and life carried us in different directions, the way it often does in small towns that slowly grow larger. I heard about his success from time to time. A technology company, offices in Chicago and New York, articles in business magazines. I never imagined our paths would cross again. Yet sitting there in Daniel's quiet kitchen, with the clock ticking and the dark still wrapped around the neighborhood, I realized something simple that I had not considered before. There was one person in this world who had once known me not as a burden, not as someone whose life had burned down overnight, but as Miss Maggie, the woman who packed his afternoon snacks and made sure he finished his homework before going outside to play. And sometimes, a memory like that can feel stronger than a house made of wood and nails. I sat in Daniel's kitchen until the first pale light of morning began to creep through the window above the sink. The quiet felt different at that hour, softer somehow, like the world was holding its breath before another long day began. I wrapped my hands around a mug of coffee that I had reheated twice already and stared out at the empty backyard. The grass was neatly trimmed and bordered by a wooden fence that looked almost decorative compared to the miles of fencing Robert and I had repaired over the years. Everything here was orderly and predictable. My farm had never been either of those things. On the farm, every morning began with a list of chores that depended entirely on weather, animals, and the stubborn moods of old equipment. Some days started with sunshine and ended with broken irrigation pipes. Other days began with storms and ended with the quiet satisfaction of a field finally planted before sunset. That uncertainty had shaped who I was. It had also shaped my son. I still remember Daniel as a small boy running across the fields with muddy boots and a red baseball cap that was always too big for his head. Robert used to lift him onto the tractor seat and let him pretend to steer while the engine idled. Those memories felt strangely distant now, like scenes from another family's life. Around 6 o'clock, I heard footsteps on the stairs, and Daniel walked into the kitchen, wearing his work shirt and holding his phone. He looked tired but determined in the way people do when they believe they are being practical. He poured himself coffee and sat across from me at the table.
For a few minutes, neither of us spoke. Then he cleared his throat and began explaining again that rebuilding the farm would cost more money than the insurance settlement would cover. He talked about contractors and supply prices and how difficult it would be for someone my age to manage 120 acres alone. His words were careful and polite, but they carried the same message Claire had delivered the night before. The farm was finished.
My life there was finished. It was time for something smaller and easier. While he spoke, I watched the early sunlight stretch across the kitchen floor. Dust moved slowly in the air like tiny floating seeds. I realized that Daniel truly believed he was helping me accept reality. In his mind, he was solving a problem, the way modern people solve everything else, with spreadsheets and reasonable compromises. But land does not fit neatly into a spreadsheet. 40 years of mornings and winters and harvests cannot be reduced to a practical decision made over coffee. Daniel eventually glanced at the clock and said he needed to leave for work. He suggested we visit one of the senior apartment complexes later that afternoon. I nodded politely because arguing would not change his mind. After he left, the house became quiet again. Claire was upstairs getting the teenagers ready for school, and the sound of running water drifted through the ceiling. I walked back into the guest room and opened the small suitcase I had packed the night before the fire, when I thought I might stay with Daniel for a single weekend while the insurance company inspected the damage. Inside were a few folded sweaters, my old address book, and a leather photo album Robert had given me for our 25th wedding anniversary. I sat on the edge of the bed and slowly turned the pages. They were pictures of the barn when it was newly painted, the maple trees when they were still thin enough to bend in strong wind, and Daniel standing beside his first bicycle in the gravel driveway. Near the back of the album, another photograph slipped loose from between the pages. It showed a much younger version of me sitting on a living room floor beside a boy with bright eyes and messy hair. Lucas Whitmore must have been 8 years old in that picture, holding up a drawing he had proudly colored with blue and green markers. On the back of the photograph, he had written in careful, uneven letters, "Thank you, Miss Maggie, for helping me learn my spelling words." I held that photo for a long time. The paper felt thin and fragile, but the memory behind it was clear and steady. And as I looked at that small, smiling boy frozen in time, the idea that had visited me during the night no longer felt uncertain. It felt like the only road left open to someone who had just lost everything, except the stories she carried with her. I held the photograph for a long time before I finally placed it back inside the album. The house was beginning to wake up around me. I could hear Claire moving through the hallway upstairs, and the faint sound of one of the teenagers opening a bedroom door. Morning light now filled the guest room, soft and pale against the beige walls, and for the first time since the fire, I felt a small sense of direction returning. When life changes suddenly, people often search for complicated answers, but sometimes the next step is very simple. I closed the album, placed it carefully in my suitcase, and reached for the old address book that had been traveling with me for nearly 30 years. The leather cover was worn smooth from time, and several of the pages had loosened along the edges. Inside were dozens of names from another era of my life. Farmers who had long since retired, neighbors who had moved away, mechanics, teachers, and church friends whose numbers had once been as familiar to me as my own. I turned the pages slowly until I reached the letter W. There it was written in my careful handwriting from many years ago, Whitmore family. Below it was a home number that I knew no longer existed, and beneath that an office number Robert had once insisted I keep in case Lucas needed a ride home from school when his parents were delayed. I stared at that number for a long moment. It seemed unlikely that it still connected to anyone I knew. The Whitmore family had moved to a much larger city years ago, and Lucas had grown into a businessman whose name appeared in newspapers and television interviews. Yet numbers sometimes lead to other numbers, and memories sometimes open doors that practical thinking keeps closed. I picked up my phone from the bedside table and sat quietly while the house filled with the sounds of morning routines. Claire's voice called down the hallway, reminding the children to hurry. Daniel's truck engine started in the driveway before pulling away toward town. I waited until the house settled again before dialing the number from the old address book. For several seconds, the phone rang with a distant electronic tone that sounded strangely formal compared to the rotary phones we once used. Then a calm, professional voice answered and introduced herself as an assistant with Whitmore Industries. I nearly hung up in that moment because it suddenly felt foolish for a woman my age to call a large company asking about a boy she had once watched after school. But the assistant politely asked how she could help me, and something about her steady tone gave me enough courage to speak. I explained that my name was Margaret Dawson from Cedar Ridge, and that many years ago I had cared for Lucas when he was a child. I told her I understood that he was very busy and that I did not expect him to remember me, but I hoped she might pass along a short message if possible. There was a brief pause on the line as she typed something into her computer. When she spoke again, her voice carried a slight note of surprise. She asked if I had been called Miss Maggie. For a moment, I could not answer, because hearing that name spoken after so many years felt like stepping back into another life. I told her yes, that was what Lucas had always called me. The assistant became quiet again for a few seconds, before saying that Mr. Whitmore would likely want to hear from me directly. She asked if I could remain on the line while she attempted to reach him. I sat there holding the phone with both hands as the connection shifted and distant music played softly in the background. Outside the window, a school bus rolled down the street, collecting children from nearby houses. Everything in the neighborhood looked ordinary and calm, yet my heart was beating faster than it had in many years. I had no idea whether Lucas would remember the afternoons we spent reviewing spelling words, or the evenings when I read him stories while waiting for his parents to return from work. I only knew that sometimes a single conversation can change the direction of a life that feels completely lost. The music on the phone line continued for what felt like a very long time, soft piano notes repeating over and over while I sat on the edge of the bed, holding the phone against my ear. I could hear the faint sounds of the neighborhood outside the window, a car passing slowly down the street, a dog barking somewhere in the distance, and the rumble of the school bus driving away after collecting the last group of children. I began to wonder if the assistant had been unable to reach him after all. Lucas Whitmore was a man who ran a large company now, the kind of person whose days were scheduled weeks in advance, with meetings and travel and decisions that probably involved millions of dollars. The idea that he would interrupt that kind of life to take a call from a woman who once helped him finish his spelling homework seemed unlikely. I was about to thank the assistant and hang up when the music suddenly stopped. There was a quiet click on the line, followed by a familiar voice that sounded bolder, but still carried the same warmth I remembered from long ago. He said my name slowly, almost as if he wanted to be certain he had not imagined it. He said, "Miss Maggie." For a moment I could not speak, because hearing those two simple words felt like stepping into a memory I had not visited in decades. I finally managed to say hello, and told him that I hoped I was not interrupting something important. Lucas laughed softly and said that some calls are more important than any meeting on his calendar. He asked how I was doing, and what had made me think of him after all these years. I explained the situation carefully because I did not want to sound as though I was asking him for help. I told him about the fire that destroyed the barn and damaged the house, and how the insurance company was still reviewing the claim. I told him that I was staying temporarily with Daniel while I figured out what came next. I tried to keep my voice steady and calm, the way Robert always did when dealing with difficult situations. Lucas listened without interrupting, and when I finished speaking, there was a long pause on the line. I could hear him breathing quietly, as if he were thinking through every detail. Then he said something that surprised me. He said that the farm had always been one of his favorite places when he was a child, because it felt real in a way the city never did. He said he still remembered feeding the chickens behind the barn and riding in the old pickup truck while Robert checked the fences along the north field. I had not realized those small memories had stayed with him all these years. Lucas asked where I was staying at the moment, and when I told him the name of Daniel's street, he repeated it slowly, as though committing it to memory. His voice changed slightly then, becoming more focused, the way people sound when they are already forming a plan. He told me that I had taken care of him during a time when his parents were building their company and often traveling for work. He said that a child never forgets the person who made him feel safe when the world around him was busy and uncertain. I tried to reassure him that those afternoons had simply been part of my job, but he gently corrected me. He said kindness is never simply a job.
It is a gift that stays with people long after they grow up. Then he asked a question that I had not expected. He asked if I would still be at Daniel's house later that day. I told him that I would, because we were planning to visit a senior apartment complex in the afternoon. Lucas did not say anything for a moment, and then he spoke again in a calm, confident tone that sounded very much like the voice of someone used to making decisions quickly. He told me to wait before making any plans about moving into a small apartment. He said there might be another option that neither of us had considered yet. I held the phone quietly after Lucas finished speaking, unsure how to respond to the calm certainty in his voice. For several seconds, neither of us spoke, and in that silence, I could hear the faint hum of traffic somewhere outside his office on the other end of the line. Finally, I told him that I appreciated his kindness, but that I did not want to cause him any trouble. Lucas responded gently, almost amused, and said that helping someone who had once taken care of him was not trouble at all. He explained that the town of Cedar Ridge had always stayed in his memory as the place where he first learned what a real home looked like. He said he still remembered the long gravel driveway leading to the farmhouse and the smell of fresh hay drifting from the barn in late summer. Hearing those details surprised me because I had never realized how much a child notices when he spends time in a place that feels welcoming. Lucas then asked several careful questions about the farm. He wanted to know how many acres were still usable, whether the well system had been damaged, and if the insurance company had already evaluated the land. His questions sounded practical and thoughtful, the kind of questions Robert might have asked when considering how to rebuild after a storm. I answered as best I could. I told him the property covered about 120 acres, that most of the fields were still intact, and that the well and irrigation system had survived the fire. The farmhouse would need major repairs, and the barn would have to be rebuilt entirely, but the land itself was still strong and fertile. Lucas listened carefully to every detail. After a moment, he said something that made my heart pause. He said that land like that is never truly lost, as long as someone still believes it has a future. Then he asked if I would be willing to show him the property later that week. I was so surprised that I almost laughed. I told him he was a very busy man, and that traveling all the way to our small town simply to look at a damaged farm did not make sense. Lucas answered in a steady voice that business success often comes from remembering where you came from. He said the lessons he learned as a child in Cedar Ridge were more valuable than any business school lecture he had attended. Those afternoons on the farm had shown him what patience and responsibility looked like. He said that if the land was still there, then the story of that farm was not finished yet. I felt a quiet warmth rise in my chest, because it had been many days since anyone spoke about the farm as if it still mattered. Lucas then told me that he would arrange his schedule, and that someone from his office would contact me later with travel details. Before ending the call, he repeated something that stayed with me long after we said goodbye. He said that people sometimes underestimate the power of small kindnesses because they do not see the future they create. A child remembers the person who helped him feel steady when everything around him was uncertain. After the call ended, I sat for a long time with the phone resting in my hands. Outside the window, the morning had grown brighter, and the neighborhood looked just as quiet and ordinary as before. Yet something inside me had shifted. For the first time since the fire, the future did not feel like a narrow hallway leading toward a small apartment and a life that no longer belonged to me. It felt like an open road stretching back toward the fields where Robert and I had built our home, one season at a time. The rest of the morning passed quietly after my call with Lucas, but the quiet felt different now. It was no longer the heavy silence of uncertainty. It was the kind of quiet that comes before something begins to move again. Around 10 o'clock, Claire came downstairs and found me sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. She glanced at the clock and reminded me that we should leave soon if we wanted to tour the senior apartment complex before lunchtime. Her voice was polite, the same careful tone she had used the night before, as if this entire situation were simply another task on the day's schedule. I told her that I might wait a little longer before making any decisions. She raised her eyebrows slightly but did not argue. A few minutes later, Daniel returned home from a short errand he had run in town, and Claire repeated the plan to visit the apartments. Daniel looked at me with the same practical concern he had shown all morning and asked if I was ready to go. I told him that I had spoken with someone earlier and that I wanted to wait before committing to anything. He asked who I had spoken with, and when I said the name Lucas Whitmore, he paused in the doorway as if the room had suddenly grown very still. Cedar Ridge is a small place, and even people who do not follow business news know that the Whitmore name carries a certain weight now. Daniel asked why Lucas would be calling me, and I explained that I had reached out to him because I remembered the years when I used to watch him after school. Daniel listened quietly, though I could see the confusion on his face. Claire crossed her arms and asked what exactly Lucas intended to do about a burned farm. I answered honestly that I did not know yet, only that he wanted to see the property before I made any final decisions about leaving it behind. The conversation ended there, because none of us had anything more to say. By early afternoon, the house had settled into its usual rhythm again. Claire drove the teenagers to school activities, and Daniel left for work once more. I remained alone in the quiet kitchen, thinking about everything Lucas had said during our call. Late that afternoon, my phone rang again. The screen showed a number from Chicago, and when I answered, a calm voice introduced herself as Emily Carter from Whitmore Industries. She explained that Lucas had asked her to coordinate a short visit to Cedar Ridge later that week. She spoke clearly and professionally, confirming the address of Daniel's house and asking whether I would be available the following morning to meet Lucas at the farm property itself. I told her that I would be there. After we ended the call, I sat by the window, watching the sunlight move slowly across the backyard fence. The hours passed quietly, and by evening, Daniel and Claire returned home. We shared a simple dinner, though the conversation remained cautious and brief. Daniel asked if I had heard anything more from Lucas, and I told him that Lucas planned to visit the farm the next day. Daniel nodded slowly but did not comment. Claire simply focused on clearing the plates from the table. That night, I packed a small bag with the same photo album and address book that had traveled with me since the fire. Before going to sleep, I stepped outside onto the front porch and looked across the quiet neighborhood. The air smelled faintly of autumn leaves, and somewhere far off, a train horn echoed across the dark fields beyond town. I realized that the next morning would be the first time I had returned to my farm since the fire. Yet instead of feeling dread, I felt something I had not experienced in many days. I felt the steady sense that the story of that land might not be over after all. The next morning arrived earlier than I expected. I woke before sunrise and dressed quietly so I would not disturb Daniel and Claire. The house was still dark when I stepped outside, and the air carried that crisp autumn chill that settles across Iowa fields just before harvest season. Daniel had offered to drive me, but I told him I would manage on my own. I borrowed his old pickup truck and began the familiar drive out of town, while the skies slowly turned pale blue above the horizon. The road leading to the farm had not changed. The same gravel path curved past the line of maple trees Robert planted the year Daniel was born. Their leaves were beginning to turn gold, and for a moment I could almost pretend that nothing had happened at all. But when I reached the top of the hill and the land opened in front of me, reality returned. The barn was gone, leaving only a dark outline where it had once stood. The farmhouse roof was partially collapsed, and the porch where Robert used to sit with his morning coffee looked fragile and quiet. I parked the truck near the old fence line and stepped out slowly. The land itself was still beautiful. The field stretched across 120 acres of rolling soil that had carried our family through decades of work and weather. A soft wind moved through the tall grass, and the distant sound of crows echoed across the empty sky. I walked a few steps forward and stood there, remembering the countless mornings when Robert and I began the day before the sun had fully risen. For a while, I simply listened to the quiet. About 20 minutes later, I heard the distant sound of an engine approaching along the gravel road. At first, I assumed it was another truck from town, but the vehicle that appeared over the hill looked different from anything that usually visited Cedar Ridge. It was a long black SUV, followed by another vehicle behind it. They slowed as they approached the gate and stopped near where I was standing. The front door opened and a tall man stepped out. For a moment, I saw not the successful businessman from television interviews, but the same boy who once waited on a front porch with a backpack full of school books. Lucas Whitmore walked toward me with an easy smile and said the same words he had spoken so many years ago when he ran into the kitchen after school. He said, "Good morning, Miss Maggie." I laughed softly because hearing that name again felt like greeting an old friend who had traveled a very long distance. Lucas looked across the field slowly, studying the land the way Robert once did when he planned a new planting season. He asked if we could walk a little farther so he could see the property from the ridge near the north field. As we walked, he asked careful questions about the irrigation lines, the soil conditions, and the condition of the remaining equipment. I answered everything honestly. When we reached the ridge, Lucas stopped and looked out over the fields for a long moment without speaking. The morning sun had risen fully by then, and the light stretched across the acres in long golden lines. Finally, he turned toward me with the thoughtful expression of someone who had just reached an important decision. He said that places like this are rare because they carry history as well as opportunity. Then he said something that made me realize the reason he had traveled all the way back to Cedar Ridge. He told me that this farm did not need to disappear. It only needed someone who believed it still deserved another beginning. Lucas stood beside me on the ridge, overlooking the fields for a long moment before he spoke again. The wind moved slowly across the tall grass, carrying the dry scent of autumn soil, and the land stretched out in quiet rows beneath the rising sun. I had looked at that same view thousands of times over the years, yet in that moment it felt different, as though I were seeing it through someone else's eyes. Lucas finally turned toward me with the thoughtful calm that successful people often carry when they have already made a decision. He told me that land like this is not only about farming, it is about legacy. It is about the work of people who believed that patience and care could shape the future of a place long after they were gone. I listened quietly while he spoke, because his words sounded very much like the things Robert used to say when we planned each new planting season. Lucas explained that he had been thinking about expanding several agricultural projects connected to sustainable farming and local food distribution. He said that most investors search for land that is easy and convenient, but places with real history are much harder to find. He looked back toward the damaged farmhouse and the empty space where the barn once stood. Then he said something simple that changed everything. He said the farm should be rebuilt. For a moment I did not respond because the idea felt almost too large to believe. I reminded him that rebuilding a barn and restoring the house would require time and resources that I did not have anymore. Lucas nodded calmly and said he understood that completely. Then he explained that he wanted to invest in restoring the property while keeping its original spirit intact. The farmhouse could be repaired. A new barn could be constructed with modern materials, but designed to match the structure Robert had built years ago.
The fields could be restored for sustainable crops that would support both local markets and future agricultural research projects. He spoke carefully, not like someone offering charity, but like a partner describing a shared plan. I felt something warm rise in my chest, because for the first time since the fire, someone was speaking about the farm as if it still had a future worth building. Lucas then said that none of this would matter if I did not want to remain part of it. He told me that the land had always belonged to the story Robert and I created there, and he would only move forward if I agreed to guide the restoration. I looked across the fields again, remembering the first fence post Robert placed in the soil when we were newly married and hopeful. I thought about the long seasons we spent working side by side, through droughts and harvests and quiet winters. The farm had never been easy, but it had always been home. I finally told Lucas that if the land still had a chance to live again, then I wanted to be there to see it happen. Lucas smiled in the same easy way he had when he was a boy, finishing his homework at the kitchen table. Later that afternoon, we walked back toward the gate where his car waited. As we talked through the early steps of the project, I noticed another vehicle pulling slowly down the gravel road. Daniel's pickup truck came into view and stopped near the entrance to the field. He stepped out and looked across the property, toward Lucas and me standing together on the ridge. For a moment, none of us spoke. Then Daniel walked closer and asked what was happening. I told him that the farm was not finished after all.